To give you perspective, when Sikich bought my company, the firm was roughly 325 million in revenue. Right now, we're run rating close to 600 million in revenue. That's tremendous growth in a 3.5-year period. I have a formula that I think about quite a bit. Is vulnerability leads to trust. Trust leads to accountability. Accountability leads to performance. So it starts with vulnerability because you can't build trust without it. If you don't have trust, you can't hold people accountable. If you don't hold people accountable, you're not going to perform.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Fearful Giants, the podcast that's getting loud about something most leaders never talk about out loud, their fear. I'm Clay Stelzer, executive coach and founder of 1560. And every week I sit down with a founder, a CEO, or an executive leader to talk about the stuff they're not typically talking about or posting about on LinkedIn. So today we've got Bobby Achettu. And Bobby is a Chicago-based entrepreneur and leader who built a company called Accelerated Growth Advisors from a founder-led consulting business into a 120-person firm. He earned 5 straight Inc. 5000 appearances with that company, and that ultimately sold it to Sikich in November of 2022. Nice job, Bobby. Bobby now serves as a principal at Sikich, where he leads operations for Sikich's business in India, along with creating and executing Sikich's global expansion strategy. How you doing, Bobby? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing great. Thanks, Clay, for having me, and thanks for the kind words there. Really appreciate being here and had a chance to follow some of your work and just excited to be here.
Well, thank you. I'm fascinated to be with you. You have quite the story, and it's fun for me to be able to chat with you about it here. We've known each other for a little bit in passing. We're both members of EO, the Entrepreneurs Organization in Chicago, but we've never really dug in together. And so, we could have just gone out and had a coffee together, but instead I figured we'd just record our intro and let the world witness us getting to know each other.
I hope you're not disappointed. So.
Oh my gosh. I know I'm not going to be disappointed. You are the mayor of EO Chicago. You were the president a few years back. I know that. And everyone I know loves you. I know people that know you well that really, really love you and are inspired by you. And so I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation. So what I want to do, I want to get to know you and I want to get to understand this journey. I am certain that people listening to this are going to be inspired and have a lot to learn from your journey through building a company from nothing, selling it, and then becoming a principal at the company that you sold it to. So I just want to dive right in. How's that sound?
That sounds great.
Okay, cool. Building a company from nothing and selling it. I mean, that's sort of the American dream. Many people think about doing that. Few people achieve it. And so I want to understand where this Bobby came from. I want to understand who must have this Bobby been as a young person to create this really impressive reality. So when I was a young person, I collected baseball cards and it was super fun. Yeah, the sport was cool, but collecting is cool and I had a lot of fun. And I would love to use that analogy to get to know young Bobby. Okay. So if I found a trading card for 10-year-old Bobby, what would it say on the front and back of that card?
Yeah, it's a great question. I could tell you what the picture would be. It's my first, I think, foray into the entrepreneurial world. Me and my buddy in the wintertime when it snowed enough to be a challenge for driveways and sidewalks, we went around shoveling. For at the time, you're talking about 40 years ago, it was probably, $3 to $5 per driveway. So that would be the picture. Again, I didn't realize at the age of 10, obviously, that I'd go on this journey, which I know we'll talk about. What it would say is never give up, honestly. You mentioned the American dream, and I'm an immigrant. I was born in India, came to the States when I was 4 years old. The traditional story you hear about where, my parents had, effectively nothing. They started out in a tiny little apartment. Eventually, we were able to buy a home that they still live in all these years later. And so, there are multiple scenarios. I think as a family, as an individual, it would have been easy to, just throw in the towel, if you will. And, the reality is this country is an amazing place. There's just opportunities to do anything and be anything we want. But there's also challenges, right? Especially, in the early years growing up and those types of things. And so, yeah, I think it would say never give up.
Never give up. And I'm imagining, given your parents' journey, that was a learned skill or learned mindset. Is that right?
Absolutely. So my dad was a qualified engineer in India. So he's basically, very similar to here in the US. There's after your undergrad, there's tests you take to get certifications. And so he had a really strong job, great career progression. But he was sponsored. He and my mom were sponsored by my uncle to come here. And unfortunately, a degree from India, especially at that time, really didn't mean a lot. So he literally started by sweeping factory floors. And so I saw that, the hard work he put in and the effort. And that was
Yeah,
something that, was really instilled in me over my early childhood.
I love it. So you learned the lesson of hard work and not giving up. In my experience, that's part of the equation that usually leads people to success. It's merging that with a unique ability or skill. So on that baseball card or that trading card, what was the unique skill that 10-year-old Bobby had in addition to the mindset you just talked about?
It's interesting growing up as an immigrant in a neighborhood where there weren't that many immigrants. I think one of the skills I learned was to read the room and to, understand people's emotions and, how to interact. As always, I had a fair amount of confidence early, even from my youth. I was fairly social as well, but I always wanted to be careful around what I said and, how I interacted with people. And, I think as I think about the evolution, just again of my journey and then my entrepreneurial career and, what I'm doing now, that was something that, I didn't know at the time, but was incredibly valuable.
Cool. Well, my next question is, what was 10-year-old Bobby's biggest fear that he would have on that trading card? You just talked about it. I'm constantly reading the room. What was the fear that drove that?
Certainly there was a level of, am I good enough? Do I belong in the room? Imposter syndrome, about, all those types of things,
Sure.
especially in those years. I remember high school. I was more social, interestingly, in grade school and junior high than I was in high school. And it's an interesting thing because the grade school I went to, there were 30 people in my graduating class. And then I go to a high school where there were over 400, right? And so it's a very different dynamic. And, I went through the stage that many people do, right? In those years, just kind of the awkward high school years. I was very fortunate. I played sports. And so I created this group around me that, helped me get through all of that. By the way, still keep in touch with. I'm one of those guys that there's 7 or 8 of us that still get together and, have dinner together. And, I'm actually this weekend going on a 100-mile bike ride with two of them. So yeah, it's fun. It's great.
I love it. I was not an immigrant, but I had awkward written right across my forehead as a as a young person trying to fit in. I mean, that's just part of growing up. It's something most all of us have to deal with. Not fun, and seems like you've done a pretty good job of finding a way to fit in. So the fantasy, it's 10-year-old. I don't know. I either wanted, what did I want to be? I think I wanted to be a professional skateboarder, but I had, once I started learning about the real world, there were things that I actually thought, maybe this is something that I would really enjoy doing with my life. What was 10-year-old Bobby's fantasy?
Yeah. And so, I wanted to be a professional basketball player, which is funny because, I'm 5'9" now. And, you know, obviously I was shorter back then. And so that was, definitely the dream, the aspiration. It's interesting as I think about back then, it was just, frankly, I didn't grow up with a lot. So as maybe not sophisticated as this may sound, I just wanted to make money. I wanted to make money for my family, to be able to take care of them. My first job out of school, I made more than my dad was making. And, he was 30 years into his career, 25 years, something like that. And so, growing up, that was a big focus. And in fact, one of the reasons my parents, really pushed me and my younger brother and my older sister around education was that so we can, get a good job, right? And especially a corporate job where there's a perception of safety and all those types of things. And so I can't remember anything else. Obviously, than being a professional basketball player, playing on the Bulls, obviously was what I wanted. But I can't remember anything else other than just reaching a point of stability where I could make sure the family's taken care of.
Yeah. So I want to talk about this money piece. Most kids in our country, at least, they turn on TV or they turn, they're on YouTube or wherever they are, social media, and we're inundated with this bullshit fantasy of, what success is or what happy people, who they are, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're all driven by money at some level, most of us at least. But it seems like you had a little bit of a different motivation, having witnessed or having experienced not having much. Is that correct? I mean, my sense is it was a little bit different for me. I wanted all the money in the world also, but that's some ghost I was chasing that wasn't actually going to lead me to success. You actually had a lived experience that you didn't want to repeat. Am I getting that right?
You are, and the concept of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? There's some baseline needs, and then all the way at the top, there's self-actualization. And certainly, we had the safety component, the roof over our heads, and all those types of things. But right or wrong, money was something that my parents really focused on. And so early on in my career, and at some point, I, obviously will in this discussion share the story. Early in my career, it's what I really focused on. I got promoted every year and a half to 2 years with the associated raises and title increases. And, that was really a focal point. I recognize now, 27 years into my career, that it's just a really bad idea to focus on money for many reasons that, I'm sure we'll get into. But
Yeah.
it was certainly a different perspective. I had friends growing up that, had a clear vision of what they wanted to do. I really didn't. It wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I actually figured out what I wanted to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I told you I've got 1,000 questions here, but I just like taking these conversations where they go. And I'm quite fascinated by your relationship with money, with your background. And so at some point, all of a sudden, I imagine in your 20s, you kept getting promoted or whatever it was. Security wasn't as big of an issue for you at that point because you had plenty.
Yeah, just to touch on that, I think I was always afraid it was all going to blow up. Really,
Ah,
just and this actually in the entrepreneurial journey that I went on was actually helpful. I was always looking around the corner, waiting for something to blow up. And so in that scenario, I was, often prepared for things that most people wouldn't have expected. And, part of this as well as I work turnaround restructuring. And so, it's a skill you get trained with, right? And, frankly, I'd grown up with that thought process, which is why I did really good in, that particular role. So, that, to the point of safety, absolutely the bank account and, all those types of baseline things, got better as I got through my career. But I don't think I ever got to the point early on where I felt like I was in a position of, you know, this is enough because I was always afraid. So,
there must have been some inflection point where that old fear, and it makes sense why you would have that fear, no longer was serving you. Like, this isn't my first rodeo. I've seen money come and I've seen money go, and I know I'm resourceful enough to ensure that I'm going to be okay.
yeah.
Do you remember at what point in your career that realization occurred to you where the fear of constantly needing to be looking around the corner to ensure your safety and your family's safety wasn't as important?
Yeah, absolutely. It was mid career before I started my company. And that was the inflection point for me. I had joined a private equity firm and it was a very prestigious role. I just left PwC in their turnaround restructuring practice. It was at that point, the height of everything I was doing. It was, at that point, the pinnacle of my career. And failure is maybe the wrong word because, things worked out from a career perspective and all those types of things. But there was almost zero cultural alignment from day one. And so I'd spent the prior 13 or so years building up these set of stairs, let's call it. And I got into an organization where I recognized, wow, it's not about the money. And private equity is, there's some firms that are amazing. And then other firms that, understandably, their main focus is returns. But I joined the firm really because of the entrepreneurs, the investors, the board. I wanted to partner with them on, this growth journey. and we were in healthcare. And so in many instances, these organizations are trying to save lives, make lives better. And so I really bought into all that, but that wasn't really the culture of the firm. And, this was a I was a sixth employee of the company, lots of really smart people, institutional capital, all the things that you would want from a firm. But that lack of cultural alignment made me realize, what, money's not everything. It'll come and go, but you need to focus on that particular aspect, and then everything else will work itself out. That's when I stopped thinking about, okay, things are going to fail around me. As
Yeah.
long as I focus on the alignment of culture, everything will work out.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thrilled that you landed in the private equity company that you did. I mean, I've got a lot to say about private equity. There's some incredible firms out there, and there's some others that choose dollar signs over anything else. I don't need to judge any of that. If that's what you want to do, that's terrific. Go for it. But it's interesting that working for a I wouldn't have imagined this. Working for a private equity firm is where you learn to get into a healthy relationship with money. That feels interesting or unique to me.
And to your point about, there's good firms that so Bain Capital is an investor in our firm, Sikich. Incredible partnership. They could not be more supportive, not just with the strategies, but, introductions, opportunities for revenue enhancement, all those types of things. So to your
Yeah,
point,
yeah,
there's, different firms out there for sure.
yeah, yeah. So we all grow up with survival strategies as young people to keep us feeling safe in the world. And most of us realize, you did at some point, wait a minute, I do have enough to remain safe. I had to learn all my lessons around no longer needing to earn my worthiness in the world. I was putting on a show for people. That was my safety mechanism. And we evolve as people, we learn, and we can put some of these fears to bed, but sometimes they show up and we carry those fears with us. But we have a different relationship with those fears. I'm kind of curious, what part of 10-year-old Bobby is still running the show today?
These questions are really make me reflect. I think there's still a component of looking over my shoulder. It's just far less than it was before. The focus on family is absolutely there. So my uncle sponsored us. He'd come to the US on a student visa from Loyola University. My dad has six brothers and sisters. And so my uncle and my dad sponsored the rest. They all had kids. They all, for many years, stayed local in Chicago. The kids had kids, right? And so my dad's side of the family, there's over 100 people here in the US. And my wife, also similar scenario. Her mom sponsored a bunch of people in the family, and they have over 100. And it's probably closer to 150. And so that family dynamic, certainly when I was younger with my dad's side of the family, and then after I got married, that surrounds us. And it's amazing because there's always a support infrastructure, and it really
Mm,
gave me the focus on family. And the other quick tidbit here, in Indian culture, it's the responsibility of the youngest son to, as the parents age, to take care of that, right? That's just, right or wrong. That's just kind of how
that's
it's
what it
been
is.
for, hundreds of years. And so my grandfather had a heart attack when I was, I think, my sophomore year in college. And my dad and my mom picked up with my little brother on 3 days' notice and moved to India, where they stayed for 2.5 years until my grandfather passed away, my grandmother passed away.
Mm.
And so I saw these things growing up, and it really, reiterated the importance of family. So I think, that's another point that, really stuck with me.
Yeah. So if 10-year-old Bobby was hanging out with us right now, given his cultural upbringing, given what he knew was important to stay safe and alive and connected, what would he be most surprised to see about who you are today as an adult?
I think part of this is through EO, through the relationships I've made over the last, 11 years or so, 12 years. I think you'd be surprised at the level of vulnerability and, what I share with people. I think, this podcast and your conversations, is an example of this, where I am willing to share just about everything under the concept of, if I can help someone to avoid some of the speed bumps and landmines and all those types of things, that makes me really happy. And so I
Yeah.
think, vulnerability is probably the first part. The second part is just, where my professional journey has taken me. I've just, done some really fascinating things that I just couldn't have imagined. And, it was almost like there was a script around it or a pathway. Because as I look back, it all makes sense. But as I was going through it, and, I relate to you in my early years, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And by the way, that was same in college. That was the same, the first 10 years of my professional career. And so, yeah, I think 10-year-old Bobby would be very surprised by that.
Man, I'm just reflecting on what you said. What a beautiful journey. I mean, for a young person, an immigrant that was dealing with fitting in, being vulnerable is not the obvious thing to do. So, I mean, look at the transition from someone that was constantly scanning the room, looking to ensure he fit in, to now someone that kind of, I don't know, at some level, you associate yourself with communities of people and your own identity of someone that's willing to be a little bit vulnerable. I mean, wow, it's pretty incredible.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love it. I want to jump in and talk about Accelerated Growth Advisors, the company you built. I want to talk about that journey a little bit. And just so people have some context as to what that is before we get into the nuts and bolts as to how you navigated that journey, can you give us just like the real quick, what was AGA, Accelerated Growth
Absolutely.
Advisors?
Yeah, absolutely. So, finance operations technology consulting firm. The vast majority of our clients, and still to this day, with Sikich, are private equity and venture capital funded. So, think as an organization scales, their infrastructure needs change. We came in, assessed, and then delivered services to help them scale and grow. So that was the firm.
Cool. And you started by yourself, is that correct?
That's correct. So I started in 2009. The way I describe it, I referenced my upbringing. It was all about, from a career perspective, my parents, everyone around me wanted to make sure that my pathway was stable. And so the concept of working in a small company or as an entrepreneur, that was just, never discussed. It was about working at big companies. That's what I did for the first 13 years of my career. And it was really that leap to private equity that gave me the exposure to the entrepreneurial space. Though I had challenges with the culture at that organization, I fell in love with the entrepreneurial space, which is part of the reason I started the firm. And by the way, at the private equity firm, I saw the need in growing organizations at different sizes to make sure they had the right infrastructure. In fact, part of my role was to, integrate roll ups and things like that. And so I saw this all firsthand, which is why I started the company. And as you referenced, it was just me at the beginning. And the first couple of years, I had a couple contractors here or there, but I was really honing my craft. I certainly had never started a company before, and I never imagined that I would. And so, there were many nights, long nights. I started the business in the storage closet of one of my clients, no windows, one electrical plug that didn't often work. And so, yeah, there was a lot of lonely days trying to figure out if, this thing was going to work.
Yeah. Looking back now at this journey you were on, and I think it was about 13 years before you sold it. Is that right? Yeah.
Yep.
What was so significant or really important to you about that chapter in your life, having built that business from nothing?
So it's interesting. Great question. When I look at that 13-year period, my evolution, not just as a leader, an entrepreneur, just as a human being, I wouldn't say 180 degrees, but pretty close. Just the focus on people has been the core component. And it's almost like what I wanted to do more than anything is make sure that the people that joined me went on a path where they can learn more and have opportunities more than they could anywhere else. And so what ended up happening with that focus, that's actually what grew the company. That's actually what allowed me to personally grow and evolve as a leader and, frankly, just do things I never imagined. And so as I think back to that 13-year journey, that was the biggest thing is the learning and growth and the evolution of just me as a person.
Very cool. I want to dig right into that one.
Sure.
That's a softball for me to dive right into and smack. So what I've heard about you, I mean, I can see it already, the big heart and the interest in, you just talked about supporting people and being with people in the world. What I've heard about you that I don't know if it's true or not, but you have equal parts sort of this warm people person, caring person with
I know where you're going with this, by the way.
the yang to your yang is I've heard you can be intense, and you are a driver of business, and you can get into numbers, and you can like really be an operator of a company. That's a tricky thing for most people to be able to balance. I would love for you to talk about how that works for you and how you got into that balance.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny as you started that line of questioning. I knew where you're going because I get this a lot, and so here's what I'd say. I think it goes back to the childhood, and always looking over my shoulder. And it's an interesting corporate journey that I had. I worked in audit, tax, consulting, FP&A, financial planning and analysis, investor relations, turnaround restructuring, and then private equity. And so this goes back to that concept. And by the way, this wasn't all at different firms. I had 3 corporate jobs. So I was basically transferring business units and trying new things, right? And so that experience gave me a set of skills, technical skills, where I was able to basically try everything within financial services, right? Culminating in private equity, which, some would argue is one of the most complex environments that you work within, right? Combine that with my undergraduate degree is in information technology. And so all these pieces fit together, and I literally had no idea. And by the way, the side note of this is the only job I've ever interviewed for was my first one. and
Cool.
and so there's a combination of the technical skills that I gained and the realization that ultimately it's, building relationships. That's been part of my entire corporate journey.
Yeah.
And the other side of it is my corporate journey and my entrepreneurial journey is I'm consistently put in high pressure situations. Thinking about turnaround restructuring, I worked in the financial services side. I was with PwC. And so we get helicoptered in to very convoluted situations where, multi-billion dollar organizations that have 3 months of runway and, 1,000 plus employees. And we had to make some quick decisions. And by quick, within a couple of weeks, and these teams were small. Typically, there was an analyst, senior manager, director level, and maybe 2 partners. And the expectation was that you change things around, you change it really quickly. So what does that mean? Operational changes, headcount changes, strategic changes. I've sat on over a dozen boards at this point over the last 15 years. All those instances for profit. I was certainly on a couple nonprofit boards, including Chicago. But the intensity of board level conversations, there's a trial by fire that
Yeah.
I really enjoy. I gravitate toward. It's what I've spent
Yeah.
my entire career doing. But then there's a realization of the importance of relationships, the importance of people, because I've seen organizations fail because they're focused on money, because they
Yeah.
don't
Yeah. Yeah.
have that North Star.
Well, let me tell you. So I meet a lot of CEOs, and sometimes, not sometimes, quite often, I'll meet some hard driving CEOs, and they'll say, "Clay, I don't have any time for any of this woo woo bullshit. We're here to drive profit." And like, great, go for it. I do believe there's many ways to get to profitability, and I'm sensing that. Will you agree with me? You're an EOer. You see the place for heart in the organization. I'm not an advocate for careless woo-ness just to do trust falls and like have it not have a purpose. But how do you? It's a real trick for most people to find a way to be hard driving while still bringing heart and connection into your teams as a leader, both with your firm and now in Sikich. How do you connect those two?
I do think going back to vulnerability, I don't say, and I think we've talked enough prior to this, is I don't say things I don't believe in, period. End stop. I just don't. And part of the reason for that is, my prior corporate experiences, I was around a lot of people that, there was a facade, there was a corporate lingo. Several of the companies, if you asked me what the vision statement was and the mission, it's just to make money. Like that was it. Like it didn't matter what was on the walls and, in the pamphlets, right? And
Yeah.
so because of that desire to always be authentic, to only say what I believe in, I think people saw that. And, I go back to, so my first quote unquote office was a storage room and a client, but the second one was actually downtown in an old warehouse in the Loop. And it was a former, they produced hats there. Okay. And I know there's actually a name for that. I don't recall what it was, but it was this 700 square foot office with carpet was awful. The walls were like crusty. I had furniture that was just like sitting around from the last tenant. I brought stuff from my house. We put paintings on the wall, right? That, were from my basement. And so there's a humility around that, again, that you become very vulnerable around. But at the same time, you got to convince people to join you. And I'll tell you, Clay, my first team member a couple years in was a guy named JP Tucker. He left Deloitte to join me. And still to this day, I stay in touch with him. He's now with Google, interestingly. So he's had an amazing career, Kellogg MBA. He's a brilliant guy. In the early days, I used to joke with him, like, what were you thinking? Why did you join, right? But he saw the
Why
vision.
do you think he joined? What did he see in you?
He saw the vision. To your point, I'm hard charging, but I have, really a focus on people. I believe through my experiences, I have a diversity of experiences, which gave me some technical skills that were extremely valuable. And I think for him, he had started a venture. He went to University of Wisconsin. He'd started a venture in college, and Deloitte was just too big of a firm for him to exercise some of those muscles. And so that's what he did. He was with me for 5 years, and it was an amazing early start to the ride. But, going back to your question here, I think that vulnerability is what it all comes back to. I have a formula that I think about quite a bit. Is vulnerability leads to trust. Trust leads to accountability. Accountability leads to performance. So like it starts with vulnerability because you can't build trust without it. If you don't have trust, you can't hold people accountable, right? If you don't hold people accountable, you're not going to perform. And so that's been a concept that, it actually wasn't until the last couple of years that I put the pieces together. But I
Cool.
recognize I've been following that pathway my entire career.
I love it. That's amazing. Well, let's just play in vulnerability. How's that? Let's just be even more vulnerable than we've been already, Bobby.
Sure.
So you're an entrepreneur, and people that listen to the show, part of why I have it here and why I have successful folks like you on is so others can learn. And you just said that's something you value also. And if you can help someone else navigate something that was difficult for you, fabulous. That's part of the show. And so I'm curious about some of the fears that you had to deal with when you were that guy in this closet, starting your company. And so I'd love to play a little kind of a fun game around this. What kept you up at night when you were starting out? What was the monster under the bed? I'm going to give you some examples. Like it could have been a cash flow monster, could have been a people monster, a reputation monster, a growth monster, an imposter monster, a losing control monster. What were the monsters under the bed that kept you up at night?
I always tell people my business is very simple. It's matching people with clients and just like making sure that that match works well. And the interesting thing about professional services is, especially in the early days, cash flow generally isn't an issue, right? Because again, you're doing that matching and there's some
Yeah,
hiring ahead, but you don't hire 50 people, at one time, right? Relative
yeah.
to, software and CPG and all these things. And so there was one year that we lost money because I did some stupid things where, as they say, my eyes were bigger than my stomach. That wasn't a concern, but there was a lot, especially in the early days of imposter syndrome. I'm pitching to private equity and venture firms that, going back to Deloitte, their alternative is Deloitte. And so in the early days, I was everything. I was playing every role. I didn't pitch to those firms until we had, 2 or 5 people, let's say, like, that part of the journey. But I had to create a perception that we were much bigger. It was really interesting. I did an event with one of the major private equity firms in town, and I was talking to the managing partner, spoke at the event, and, it was a great turnout of clients, strategic partners, all those things. And as we're talking, remember at this point we had 15 people at the firm, right? So we're in the early stage. He thought we had 250 people. So we're like talking through things that I share with them. He asked the question and
Uh,
I said, yeah, we have 15 people. He was like flabbergasted because of the vision and even the topics we were covering. Right. And so there were a lot of situations where, similar to my childhood, where I'm in a room and I'm like, do I belong here? I think the other thing, the monster under the bed, and this is one of the things, it's hard to say I regret parts of the journey. It really is, because there's so much learning. But there were times I wasn't mentally present at home. And as I was going through it, I felt tremendous guilt. But
Mm,
interestingly, when I got to the other side, it was actually more guilt. Whereas, like, because you're reflecting, and my kids are 21, 18, and 14. And they would tell you, we've had this conversation because I've been vulnerable with them. I've essentially apologized to them for not
mm,
being fully mentally present. And, their response is like, what are you talking about? You're a great dad. You were then and now. So it's like very humbling
yeah.
and wonderful to hear that. But that was a monster under the bed. Is it worth it? And I thought about that many times, but at a certain point, I'd built the firm. I'd built a firm where there were too many obligations. Like I couldn't leave. And it wasn't ever a situation where, I was jailed by the firm and where I like hated it and I wanted to leave. I never got to that point. There were many instances where I was like, wait a minute, is this worth it? Because there's aspects of my life that, the great thing, I didn't have to travel a bunch. I still don't travel a ton. I've got a couple of international trips a year and then one or two nighters periodically. But it was the mentally present part that I felt really guilty about.
Thanks for sharing that. And I love you being vulnerable with your kids. Sometimes doing that's the hardest thing. It has been for me from time to time. You apologize to them. Oh my gosh, I love that. And what a lesson that is for them to see someone that they care about and respect being vulnerable, taking responsibility for what they believe they did to create whatever impact you believed. I love that. That's a huge lesson. Imposter syndrome. I mean, it's a buzzword, and it's a buzzword because I don't know too many people that have never dealt with that. Most CEOs, most leaders have that at some level. And there's different strategies for how to deal with it. You created some image that you were a 250 person firm when you were 15 or something like that, like you just mentioned. How did you handle your imposter syndrome when it showed up?
I still periodically feel that, and if you're pushing the limits and, as you said, I'm a hard charger, you're going to feel it. What I realized is people want you to succeed. People want you to succeed. I speak quite a bit in a bunch of different venues, right? And people have asked me, how have you gotten used to this, right? Because it's one of people's biggest fears. And my response is, first and foremost, practice. It's just like you do enough reps, you get comfortable in front of a group.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, generally speaking, nobody in your audience wants you to fail. And so when you recognize that, it's almost a breakthrough moment where you get much more comfortable. So in a similar vein, in the rooms I've been, people don't want you to fail. Now, there's
Yeah.
definitely situations where there's like an adversarial component to it where somebody feels like they need to win. There's definitely that. But at the same time, you do enough reps of that and you get really comfortable as well too. Like this was one of the things in turnaround restructuring. We were actually trained for this. Like I could spend 20 minutes talking through the things that we were trained for where we got helicoptered into these adversarial situations. So again, going back to you do enough reps and then you recognize people actually want you to succeed. That's where you can elevate away from the imposter syndrome.
I think it's great. I agree. I know that you've done some, or maybe you still are. You're an adjunct professor at Kellogg. Yeah. So
So
I had a
actually in the undergraduate program. So
undergraduate.
yeah, at Northwestern and Loyola. Yeah.
I spoke there, I don't know, a number of years ago. And for whatever reason, I was really in it. I was nervous. I mean, I speak a lot. I don't know what was going on, but I think this was shortly after I started my own company. And I just, imposter syndrome, the whole thing. And the way out of it for me is to shine a light on it. And I went up on stage. There was a room full of MBAs looking at me. And I said, my name's Clay Stelzer. And if you were to really know me right now, you'd know I'm scared shitless to be up here in front of you. And then from there, it was smooth sailing and it was a great presentation. And because I like using the insecurity because everyone's in imposter syndrome, everyone suffers from the same fears. Like, how many of you competitive MBAs are scared to fail? How many of you can relate to what I'm going through right now? And actually, let's talk about that. That's what this conversation is going to be about. So I love using the lemons when they're offered to you. That's been a strategy I've used around my imposter syndrome that's always been really, really helpful.
Totally.
So I want to get into the transition. So let's just start with the basic stuff. In 2002, you sold it to Sikich. Why did you sell?
2022. So
Oh, 22.
2002,
What did it? Yeah, sorry, 22.
2002, I was, still in that warehouse in the loop. So 2022. So just to take a couple steps back, 2018, 2019, consolidation started happening in our industry. Some of the first players started putting money in our space. And part of it is you had to restructure your company in order to do that. And without getting into the details, it was a big change in the industry. In fact, a lot of people were skeptical of it. And what happened is COVID was a big milestone for our industry in that, setting aside the health implications, obviously, it was just a boom for our industry, because what ended up happening is the concept of not being physically in the office at your client site that allowed for, just the ability to get work done anywhere. Right. And it also reiterated the importance of financial reporting and planning and all those types of things. The other thing that happened is even more private equity money started flowing into our industry. So that's one component, is consolidation happening in our industry. The other component is sole founder. I had a handful of my leaders that had some equity, but I was, a super majority owner of the company. And so there's, certainly some benefits of that, right? The financial benefits, the ability to drive vision and all those types of things. But there's also a huge burden that is on your shoulders. And at a certain point, in the early days when we were 1.5, 20, 25, ultimately the risk associated with losing it all is certainly a challenge. But at the same time, the dollar amounts, while substantial, are not going to change your life. Okay. However, when you build a firm to 120 people, there's a tremendous amount of risk in that another COVID happens. Existential black swan type scenario that, in the case, as I referenced with COVID, outside of the health implications, we grew substantially. But what if it goes the other way? And all the time, effort, and energy, and what I've given up and what I've put in. So that was another component, right? So that risk profile. And then the last piece that I think was very critical was just this component around the next step for me was to hire a CTO, a head of sales, a chief human resources officer, and to really double down on technology. So not just hiring a CTO, but invest. And we had a technology practice that represented about 20% of our revenue, which is integral to what we're doing. But we need to double down on that. And so as I thought through that level of investment, and I've done enough advising to growth organizations, I've sat on, a bunch of boards and a bunch of different industries. And generally speaking, you get it right, hiring senior leaders like that 60% of the time. So, between all of those folks and that investment is just like, I had this spreadsheet thinking about what growth looks like and what I'd have to invest. And then frankly, the equity I'd have to grant for these senior leaders. And between all these three things, and by the way, going back to consolidation, as you know, and anyone in financial services know, each industry goes through a period of consolidation, various periods. And it's impossible to time these things. But the cycles for private equity are typically 5 years. So as I referenced, we were still in that 5-year period. And what happens was when an organization retrades, that's when you actually figure out if the multiples are lower or higher. So there's risk that when companies start to retrade, that the multiples are lower. So there was quite literally a scenario, Clay, where I could have grown my business 15, 20% a year for the next 5 years. But because the multiples change, it's actually worth less than if I'd sold earlier. And so I was actually, when I started to think more about the metrics and the financials, I recognized that, hey, I think this is the right time. And then probably the last part of this is I went through a process. So we had a banker. It was about a 10-month process. And the team at Sikich is just absolutely amazing. And, they've actually on the other side of this delivered in spades to what they committed. Like literally every box has been checked and more so. And so that was a big part. Had the opportunity to, obviously spend a lot of time with the CEO, a bunch of time with their senior leadership team. And so there was a connection there. So
Yeah. Was it what you imagine? I mean, it seems like Sikich has really stepped up, which I imagine is a relief to you. You do have a lot of heart. I'm guessing you did care about the company and the people that you employed. What's it been like for you to no longer be the top of the mountain, to be a partner? I mean, that's a big transition for a lot of people. What's that been like for you?
yeah. And so to go back to my people, so as any part of a transaction, you have to identify, key people that you want as part of the transaction because it changes the risk profile, right? It's like all of a sudden the day you close, a bunch of people quit, right? And so out of the 120, we identified 19 people. Okay. Out of the 19, 3.5 years later, only 3 are no longer with the company. One retired, and then 2 others found just really great opportunities that, frankly, I would have said, hey, and I did say, this is great. So
Yeah.
3.5 years later, 16 of 19, I think that's 84%. I did the calc one day are still here. So that to me is the most important metric. Okay.
Yeah.
The other aspect of it that you referenced, right? So there's probably 3 things as I think about it. One is I don't get to make every decision anymore, but Clay, I'm really grateful for that. I'm
Yeah, I
really
bet.
grateful. And an organization this size there's a complexity to it that brings me to the second thing is context matters. I move fast. As you referenced, we made the 5,000 list 5 years in a row. Our annualized growth rate over 13 years I had the business was 37%, which is actually, for a services firm, it's pretty impressive. And we had no salespeople. We had no sales. It was, the quality of the work we did and the network and strategic partners that we had, right?
Wow.
And so I moved fast. The team moved fast. This organization, while we're extremely entrepreneurial, there's some things you can't. Context matters. And so the first piece around, having visibility and, effectively making every key decision. The second piece around, context matters. You can't just change a bunch of things because there's different business units that get affected. And then the third thing is this concept of, I don't know what the next 2 to 5 years looks like. And at the old company, I had a very clear path and, I was actually, progressing toward it, which is eventually I'd be the chairman of the board, less day-to-day operational, more mentorship, and the ability to, just basically do whatever I wanted. And by that, professionally serve on boards, invest, all those types of things. That was the pathway. That was my target. Here, to give you perspective, when Sikich bought my company, the firm was roughly 325 million in revenue. Right now, we're run rating close to 600 million in revenue, somewhere between 500, 550 and 600. And that's a combination of organic and acquisition, right? And so that's tremendous growth in a 3.5 year period. Took on capital from Bain about 2 years ago. We've grown our international footprint tremendously. We effectively quadrupled it since I joined the firm. Our technology practice, which by the way, half our revenue is technology and advisory, which is very unique in the middle market. Our AI strategy is, I think, one of the best in our industry. So there's all these pieces that I cannot project even a year or two now what role I'm going to have, what I'll be doing. In fact, there was some changes that have been amazing. I've had 5 different bosses in 3.5 years, all board
Hmm.
members that I learned from each and every one of them. And, I think for a lot of people, that would be very disconcerting. It's
Sure,
like,
sure.
oh, like, how does that work? But I've learned from every single one of them. And they've frankly contributed to my learning and growth in a way that is much more than I had at my old company.
Yeah.
So,
That's so cool.
the point being, I think this forward looking approach, it just is less clear, but it actually excites me.
Yeah. So, in any big change like this, oftentimes there is something keeping us in the back chapter that is getting in the way of us fully being present in the next chapter. What did you have to let go of to really allow yourself to be fully in at Sikich?
I had an original plan of staying my 2 year commitment and then most likely leaving the firm and, going on the next chapter of sitting on boards and investing, as I referenced. And it was probably a month in frankly, that I was like, wow, this place is different. It really is. The leadership, they're following through on their commitments, the integration plan, all those types of things. There was a progression where I saw, again, in the first few weeks, really, that this is a very unique organization. There's a lot of opportunity here. And most importantly, as I referenced earlier, my team can really thrive. And so, that was probably, and, as you well know, most entrepreneurs whose businesses get acquired, they will go through their commitment period and they leave. Right. And, I still talk to a lot of my friends who run companies or, post exit, and they're shocked I'm still around. And, to be candid, I don't plan to leave unless they ask me to leave. I plan to end my professional career here. Whatever timeline, I don't know, as I referenced, I don't know what the next 2 to 5 years look like, but it's just culture, the vision, the opportunity for learning and growth for my people. I've worked at a lot of big firms, a lot of great firms. I've never seen this before.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, what a fun story. I've done a little bit of work with Sikich, and the growth has been fun to see. I have some really wonderful friends there that are just the best. I'm thrilled to hear that you've had this experience there. That's really, really, really cool. Yeah, I love it. So, in this last segment of our conversation, you just started talking about your team, and I want to talk about your team in India and this global expansion that you've been a huge part of, leading that charge. If your team in India was listening to this conversation right now, what do you think they'd be most surprised to hear?
These are great questions, Clay. You know what? I don't think they'd be surprised by any of this. And the reason is, in some form or fashion, I've said all this to them. When I don't do a lot of interviewing anymore, just because our leadership team is pretty established both in the US and India. But in the instances I'm hiring at that level, what I tell them is, listen, this is 100% most certainly not going to be an easy job, right? I can commit that to you, but you will learn and grow here more than you could possibly do anywhere else. That theme of learning and growth, again, going back to vulnerability, it's all included. I haven't necessarily, for no reason that it just hasn't come up, the 10-year-old Bobby thing. And certainly if somebody had asked me, I would have brought it up. But,
Sure.
that might, of all the things, as I reflect, that might be, the only thing that might be surprising.
Okay. So I love that. That's great. I love, vulnerability is at the top of that pyramid you talked about that leads to trust. So maybe I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How do you want your team to see you, and how do you fear that they actually see you?
So it's interesting. As I reference, I'm a hard charger. I expect a lot. We have metrics, we have goals. And candidly, one of the reasons that my business unit is successful is because we hit our targets, right? It's an expectation. And so I want the team to see me as the combo you referenced, hard charger, but at the same time, empathetic, focused on their development. I take the responsibility of the several hundred people that report into me very seriously. And sometimes it would be very easy to see the hard charging part because I do at times over rotate focused on that. And part of the reason is I really see the vision of this firm, and I feel not just the responsibility of the people, but to the vision, which then will create opportunities for the people. And so
Yeah.
it wouldn't surprise me if somebody, as an example, that hasn't worked with me closely, maybe like a couple layers down, that they might think like, wow, he's intimidating. I've gotten that a lot in my career, which is just like perplexing to me because I feel like I'm the least intimidating guy there is. I know I'm intense, especially in certain situations. What happens, and this is probably training, the more convoluted something gets, the more clear I see. It's just a weird thing.
Hmm.
And because of that, there are situations where I may come off as maybe too intense, right? And so
Hmm.
anyway,
Yeah.
that's how I would think about it.
I love that. What's the soft side of you that people may not see that you might want them to see?
I love my cat. That might be the answer. So we got a cat, oh boy, like probably 10, 12 years ago, and I was tricked into it.
Okay.
I'm embarrassed to admit, but I've just never been a pet person, which I say embarrassed because people have told me you can never trust somebody that doesn't love pets like that. I've heard this and that always was drilled into my head. And so the kids wanted to get a cat. And it's a long backstory. There's an April Fool's joke played on me where they pretended that they gotten a cat. They sent me pictures, everything. And so I'd mentally gotten into this state of mind where it's like, well, I can't believe they did this, but we have a cat at home. And I finally got okay with it. I found out it was a big joke and I actually was a little sad. And then so I self-reflected and I realized, oh, maybe I want a pet. Next thing you know, 3 months later, we have a cat. And it's just an interesting scenario to go through that. And frankly, not a lot of people, know about that. And so I think that'd be surprising.
I love it. So, folks in India that work for Bobby, as soon as you start thinking he's a little bit too much hard charging, did you know he has a cat?
Yeah, that's right.
You can't be that hard charging if you're in love with a cat. I love it. I think it's funny. You don't trust someone if they, what is it? If they don't have a pet or don't like pets, what was that?
Yeah, pretty much. Don't trust anyone that doesn't like pets. Effectively, there's probably a better phrasing around it, but that's the thing.
Yeah. What's your cat's name?
Chili pepper.
Chili. And what does chili bring out in you? Listen, my dog's not in here now, but like oh my gosh, I adore my 80-pound black lab. He is a son to me. He has my full heart. What does chili bring out in you that maybe others don't see, or it's only chili can bring out in you?
Yeah, so I think part of it is I really enjoyed the early years of the kids, and not
Oh,
necessarily the infant stage, but call it 3 to 7, 3 to 8. And there is a component where no matter how old the cat is, Chili is, you still think of it as, this little cuddly pet. I think the other thing is I love how the kids and Julie, my wife, interact, with Chili. I frankly am not necessarily as, hugging the cat, kissing the, all that kind of stuff. But I love that interaction.
yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I'm really glad that, I never know what the heck we're going to get into in these conversations. I would not have predicted this part of the conversation, but I love it. I love knowing that about you. Well, I think we're about to wrap up here. I was going to ask you what's next for Bobby, but I mean, you already answered. You don't really know what's happening in Sikich, but man, you love the company. Is there anything else when you think about, your legacy, when you think about this vision of your life and you consider this 10-year-old Bobby and his vision, what is left to do within Sikich, without, outside of Sikich and your personal life? What's left for you to really do?
There are a bunch of people that I could see leadership potential and future trajectories of people's career clearer than they could see in themselves. There's several people that I've said, listen, like I'm just telling you, I believe in you more than you believe yourself. And you just gotta realize that I'm 27 years into my career or whatnot. I've just seen enough and you're gonna kill it. Okay. That's happened. And so there's a bunch of people that I'm very proud to say, I was at a point where I could help them see that in themselves. And also they're well on their trajectory, that I referenced, where they're going to be bigger, faster, stronger than I ever was. And so to the point of legacy, that's what I want. There's people that I work with now that I've worked in the past that are going to outshine me beyond anything they can imagine. And so when you think about what's next, I want to just continue doing that. Frankly, until the end. I don't plan to ever stop working until I'm, physically unable. Now, the work may look different than I'm doing now, but it's all going to be centered around developing people, giving them opportunities, identifying these folks that, maybe need some guidance and, are incredibly high potential, no ceilings, right? But they don't realize it themselves.
Oh, yeah. Who is the person that shared their view of your potential with you?
Yeah, great question. So a family friend of ours, incredibly talented, brilliant guy, Loyola undergrad, Harvard MBA, and became a senior executive at a medical products, then a pharma company. I didn't necessarily spend a ton of time with him, but I remember meeting him specifically to ask him his opinion around leaving PwC, which, again, the trajectory I had in my career, to go work at this private equity firm as employee number 6. And the guidance he gave is basically there's no downside. And I was thinking, what do you mean? Like there's significant downside, right? And he shared this concept of, look, you don't understand. If this fails, you go back to corporate if you so desire. And the story you have to tell, imagine interviewing somebody that all they did is go, up this ladder, at the standard ladder. And, he didn't necessarily use those words of I believe in you more than you believe. But that was the concept he was saying is like there's no downside. Like you're going to win either way. And so, I would say he was one from a career perspective. My parents, absolutely, they certainly pushed me and all those types of things. But I asked my dad at one point, and he doesn't know a lot about the technical part of the business. And I asked my dad, like, did you think that my career would look like this? And he said, absolutely. Right. And so I think he saw some of this in me, even through my crazy teenage years and,
Yeah.
all those types of things. And, my mom's the same way. So.
Yeah. Isn't it fun to pay it forward?
Absolutely.
My favorite thing in the world. If I can help someone in a way that I needed to be helped, nothing brings me more joy than that. Yeah, I love it. Bobby, this has been awesome. I have thoroughly enjoyed my chat with you. Boy, do I know you better than when this conversation started, as does the world. Is there anything you want to pitch? Anything you want to share about Sikich? Anything that's important for you to share with listeners before we sign off?
Yeah, it's interesting when I talk about the firm, which I do quite a bit, I actually focus on the culture, versus the service offerings and all those types of things, but the service offerings are important. So we have 40 plus service offerings with an incredible mix between, let's say, audit and tax, wealth management, NetSuite implementation, data analytics, AI, all those different things. And I always say we're the most tech-enabled professional services firm in our industry. And the reason I say that is that diversity of service offerings, right?
Mm.
And the other piece of it is really interesting is we are officially defined as having 4 pillars. There's ATW, Audit Tax Wealth Management. There's Client Solutions, which is a lot of our technology stuff. There's Business Advisory Services. And then there's Government Services. But the beauty of it is those silos are simply for an org chart. Like there's a lot of times I've been on pitches or client delivery where we have 3 folks from completely different lines. And by the way, we'll do a lot of training development. We'll do a lot of those things that, in other words, like we're not necessarily always paid for that. And so, that's a culture that comes from the top down, from our leadership, from our CEO. And so, I think, listen, all the service offerings, the technical skill, all those types of things are really important. But our culture of learning and growth, I think is better than, and, I say this, having been at many firms, having built my own firm, never seen a culture like this.
So cool. And if people are interested in learning more about either you or the culture at Sikich, where do they go?
But starting out with the website, taking a look at the organization, but, absolutely, they can reach out to me. So.
Yeah. And you can find Bobby on LinkedIn, amongst other places. Well, again, thank you so much. This wasn't a short amount of time. You're a busy guy. I really appreciate you taking the time. I hope this was fun for you.
It was. Yeah. Great questions, by the way. It really, like I said earlier, makes you reflect. And so I really appreciate that.
You're so welcome. And listeners, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. And if you did, please follow the show and join me, Clay Stelzer. Each week, we stop pretending, we name our fears, and we remember what it takes to stand tall as the giants we already are. When leaders get real, they make it safe for others to do the same. So please subscribe or follow wherever you listen to podcasts, share with other leaders, leave a review if you're inclined, and help more people feel what's possible when fear doesn't run the show. Thank you so much.